Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this really interesting conversation on does international law make the world more equal? Today, we will be really delving into the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda, and whether the SDGs 5 on gender equality, SDG 10 around reducing inequality, and SDG 16 around peace, justice, and inclusion, whether this in the parameter of international law and international institutions really help contribute to a more equal world. In doing so, we'll be looking at it through the lens of three dimensions: institutional design, participation, and practice. I'm honored to be the moderator for this discussion today. I have an impressive and amazing all women panel here today with us. Which particularly poignant was we'll be discussing inequality. um, I'll start off. We have Ms. Kate Gibson, who serves as an Assistant General Counsel at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative's Office of General Counsel. In this capacity, she represents the United States in disputes before the World Trade Organization and provides legal advice on services and investment issues in the negotiation of U.S. trade agreements. She has previously practiced law at a large international law firm in DC and served as a trial attorney in the Civil Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. She holds a Juris Doctor and an LLM from Duke University School of Law and a Bachelor of Arts from Wake Forest University. Fatima Sumar is the Vice President of Global Programs at Oxfam America, where she oversees Oxfam America's regional development and humanitarian response. Fatima comes to Oxfam with a distinguished career in U.S. government, leading U.S. efforts to advance sustainable development and economic policy in emerging markets and fragile countries. Most recently, she served as Regional Deputy Vice President for Europe, Asia, Pacific, and Latin America at the U.S. MDC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC, where she managed investments focused on international growth and poverty reduction. Prior to MCC, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia at the U.S. Department of State as a senior professional staff member on the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. She holds a master's in public affairs from Princeton, the Woodrow Wilson School, and a Bachelor of Arts from Cornell. She also studied at the American University in Cairo. Last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Chantal Thomas, who is a professor of law at Cornell Law School, where she also directs the Clark Initiative for Law and Development in the Middle East and North Africa. She teaches in the areas of law and development and international economic law. Prior to joining Cornell, Professor Thomas chaired the law department of the American University of Cairo and also served on the University of Minnesota and Fordham University law faculties. She has been a visiting professor teaching international economic law at institutions such as Harvard Law, Stanford Law, the Center for Transnational Legal Studies in London, and the Suzhou University in China. Professor Thomas has consulted for the USAID, Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Affairs, and she has served on the U.S. State Department's Advisory Committee on International Law, and as vice president and on the executive council of ASIL. Professor Thomas focuses her scholarship on the relationship between international law, political economy, and global social justice in a variety of contexts, with a focus on international trade and international migration. She has a bachelor's from McGill University, her Juris Doctorate is from Harvard Law School, and her PhD is from Cambridge. As I mentioned, it is a distinct honor to be the moderator of today's conversation. Thank you so much, panelists, for joining us. As we dive in, first I want to set a little bit of a tone around the SDGs. Starting in 2015, of course, the global community and international organizations came together to set an ambitious agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals, really seeking to reset silos across different issue areas and foster greater collaboration and integration of these ambitious goals across the 16 goals. As it pertains to inequality, this was really an underlying purpose and objective of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the institutions that are tasked with really addressing and implementing them have a heavy burden. We're now 5 years into implementation, with 10 years and really the entirety of the global community really facing the pertinent issues of inequality are kind of have been brought to the forefront through the the current crisis and other issues. I really would love to hear your perspectives as it pertains to whether international law makes the world more equal. And I'll start with Ms. Gibson.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm happy to start. And first of all, I wanted to just say thanks to Kish and Kim and all of the ASIL organizers of this meeting. I'm very much looking forward to the discussions. I should also say what I do in most of my life is write briefs and think about whether or not you've got a comma or a semicolon or an and or an or in an agreement, or whether there should have been one and it wasn't. So thinking about this, thinking about the issues that are raised in these discussions has helped me think about some new issues for me. So it's very much been a learning experience already, and I'm really looking forward to learning from the experts we have here and also in the audience. So as I was thinking about sort of our opening question, does international law reduce global inequality or contribute to it? I was thinking about this in a trade context in particular. Does international trade law reduce global inequality or contribute to it? And I think international trade law creates a framework that has the potential to reduce global inequality. International trade law sets up rules that promote ideas such as non-discrimination, fairness, transparency, predictability, and trade law not only sets up the rules, but attempts to make sure that they're enforced, to set up ways to make sure that these rules move forward. And I think those same principles of non-discrimination, fairness, transparency, these are the same principles that can also reduce global inequality. I think trade law has had benefits overall, particularly with the creation of the WTO and a number of other large or multilateral, bilateral agreements. But it has to be said those benefits have not been necessarily enjoyed by all people in all places. They have not been enjoyed in an equal manner. There's been a lot of criticism of trade law, both now and in the past. I think there's various groups that question whether trade law has been written against them or has been written in favor of others, whether international trade law actually accommodates everyone. I think those are legitimate questions, and there are ongoing discussions of those issues. And the Sustainable Development Goals are considerations that can be included in those type of discussions, which are ongoing. I would say I choose to be an optimist. Can international trade law reduce global inequality? I think it has the capacity to do so, and it's being worked on by a lot of different folks.
Great, thank you. Ms. Sumar, what about you?
So Kimberly, first, it's really great to be with all of you. And I love being on an all-women panel. So really appreciate and congratulations to the American Society of International Law for taking their 2020 meeting virtual and on Zoom. And it's really great to be with Kate from USTR and Chantel from Cornell Law and with the Carter Center, Kimberly, with you. So thanks so much for having me on. I'm Fatima Sumar with Oxfam America, and I just wanted to scene set the question, Kimberly, for a moment for our audience so that we appreciate the extent of what we're talking about here. Before COVID broke out, we knew in our report that Oxfam put out in January 2020, ahead of the World Economic Forum, we knew that the world's 2,153 billionaires have more wealth than the 4.6 billion people who make up 60% of the planet's population. Right? Global inequality today is so deeply entrenched in our systems, in our law, in our legal systems, in our normative behaviors, in our policies, and it's so vast. One of the things at Oxfam is a global international NGO. Our mission is simple but profound, which is to end the injustice of poverty. We know how deeply tied poverty is to inequality, right? And as an example of that, we've estimated with others in the UN and others that with COVID-19, if we don't take the steps collectively to fix the situation and address the urgent needs of the most vulnerable, we can push an additional 500 million people into poverty just because of our unequal response to COVID-19 all around the world for the most vulnerable. So the scene that I just want the audience to really appreciate as we talk about the SDGs in this really powerful conversation today is that we live in a world today where 22 of the richest men in the world have more wealth than all of the women in Africa, right? Let me just say that one more time. 22 men in the world have more wealth than all of the women in Africa today. That's our normative behavior today of what we think is acceptable. So as we think about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, you know, the question you ask is a quite complex one, actually, right? Have they contributed? Does international law contribute to global inequality, or does it make it better? And I think it's both. I think it's both. So first, just say, you know, law is an institution, and I'm not a lawyer, by the way, but I live within the norms, but law as an institution is really slow to change. And it tends to reinforce the status quo because there's a lot of inertia, right, embedded in the fact that our laws and our courts are rooted in precedent, right? And precedent can take time to change. So often what we see around the world and here in the United States is legal systems are designed, run, and they favor oftentimes white men, people in power, at the expense of the most vulnerable, at the expense of the most marginalized, and at the expense of people of color. And that's certainly true here in the United States, and you're seeing an entire movement on the streets here in the US as a result of that. So law can be a tool to protect minority rights, but too often we're seeing it preserves a function of the status quo. But the opportunity here, though, and with the SDGs, is that we know that because the aim of law is justice, which is very powerful, it can yield a really powerful tool to really help address that. So, you know, as we think about the challenges for this conversation, I just highlight a few of them for our discussion. First is sovereignty and the lack of political will for many states to actually adhere to parts of international law, human rights law in particular. Second is globalization and how that's led to huge gaps in accountability, particularly around human rights, and the role of and the complicity of many states to address these gaps. The third is how the law can be used for the powerful and the powerless, and how we think about the functions doing the exact opposite in a lot of these cases. And then the fourth, just to say, is, and I'm really glad Kate started with the role of trade law and corporations. We live in a world where out of the 100 largest economic actors in the world, the majority are not governments, right? 69 out of the 100 are companies. They're companies. So how is it possible for governments to regulate and hold private actors accountable when the companies are literally bigger and more powerful than the governments that are regulating them, right? And that is the discussion I think that we need to be having as we think about what are our options and the pathways forward. So I just wanted to end, by saying that, at Oxfam, we've seen really great examples of using international human rights law and jurisprudence to advance regional human rights in this context. But the SDGs in particular can be quite powerful in setting new normative behavior as we think about new ways to do that, both in fighting current norms and creating the new norms that we want to see to do that. So I love how the SDGs really create for us a race to the top dynamic and a goal, but it's not going to be enough alone. And at Oxfam, we believe, very much in that we need a mechanism to help enforce them, and we think that mechanism is active citizenship. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Thomas, what about your thoughts? Does international law reduce global inequality or contribute to it?
First of all, let me make sure that you can hear me. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It is really such an honor to be with you, with my co-panelists and moderator, and with the audience. And I'm really looking forward to a discussion here that I think will be really important and really exciting. These are crucial issues. And as Fatima mentioned, a lot of these questions now are being asked in the streets, are being asked in the media, are being asked really in places and by people where we haven't seen these kinds of questions being posed in such a candid way. And so I think we have a moment here to maybe to reevaluate some of these questions and some of the traditional answers. Let me back up a little bit and come back to your question. Does international law promote inequality or equality? Is it part of the problem or part of the solution? And maybe in giving a few preliminary remarks, try to tie together or bridge the gap in some ways between Kate's comments that we have, a lot of promise in the way the institutions are designed with core principles of non-discrimination, fairness, and transparency. And Fatima's observations that we live in a world of really profound inequality. And so how is it that we can have these institutions with laudable principles, and at the same time, we have these outcomes of profound inequality, in some places deepening inequality. So focusing on the SDG 10, inequality in general, but definitely, hopefully in the other questions, we can bring it back to some of the other SDGs as well. And I think both of our other speakers have said, well, it's sort of both. International law is part of the problem and are also part of the solution at times. International economic law has changed a lot, obviously. It's gone through a lot of tumult over the last few years with a bunch of different trade wars, the rise of unilateralism, and so on. But if we look at the larger trend lines, what we can see is that we have seen a partial convergence across rich and poor countries over the post-Second World War era, where the Bretton Woods International Economic Law Framework and the GATT-WTO framework have been in place. There are some countries in the developing world that have rapidly grown in terms of their national economic output, and that has had a beneficial impact on poverty. So obviously the case in point would be China. China is now the world's top exporter of manufactured products, but many other countries as well, many other emerging countries, Brazil, India, Mexico, South Africa, many of the Asian economies have gone from developing to high income countries over this time period. And in many cases that has meant real on the ground progress. So hundreds of millions of people have emerged from extreme poverty in China alone. And it's one reason why the Millennium Development Goal of reducing the number of people who live in extreme poverty in the world by half was met and was exceeded. And so those are real victories and they should be celebrated. But if we think about Fatima's observations, we can see that there's still a huge level of inequality, and there are real causes for concern, and we can divide those conceptually into the fact that even though we've had this partial convergence between rich and poor countries, it's only been partial. So some developing countries have seen great gains in poverty reduction, and others have not. If we break down the gains in poverty reduction by region, we see that there have been many gains in Asia. The poverty reduction line in sub-Saharan Africa has remained relatively flat, even though there's been actually, in many cases, some exciting growth in sub-Saharan Africa, but so far the ability to convert that growth into poverty reduction has been limited, and that's true for other countries as well. Like Mexico's had, to some extent, an economic growth success story with economic growth on the one hand, but much more limited in terms of reducing poverty. So one issue is that the gains that have been made and the success stories that have been realized have been limited, and they've been somewhat geographically limited as well across countries. The other issue with inequality is that inequality within countries, as we heard with respect to the billionaires who control a huge amount of the world's wealth, inequality within countries, both rich and poor, has been rising. We've certainly seen that in the US. It's one of the reasons for the political instability that we are seeing. You can see how incredibly destabilizing this level of inequality is. So we've seen some success, we've seen some real problems emerge, but what does any of this have to do with international economic law? Well, if we consider those starting principles that Kate identified, non-discrimination, fairness, transparency, that those have been, again, only partially realized. It's true that in some cases you've seen massive gains, for example, in trade barrier reduction, but in other places that has been much less successful. So to take the issue of trade in agriculture, and this was an issue that Oxfam picked up on, has picked up on really through the time of the Doha development negotiations from 2001 onward, that there's been much less willingness to provide market access to developing countries in agricultural trade, and that has been a real problem for those developing countries whose export focus has been in agriculture. So you might say, well, the reason China and some of the other economies have succeeded and other developing countries have failed is that those economies that succeeded focused more on open trade. They embraced the principle of the free market. But that would actually be an incorrect conclusion, because a lot of what is going on, there are many, many reasons why development occurs in some places and others. Governance, there's political stability, there's access to capital, lots of things, but trade also plays part of the equation. And the rules around access, market access in agriculture are much more difficult for developing country exporters than in manufacturers. And that's a question of design of the rules, and it's a question of implementation of these goals of non-discrimination, fairness, and transparency. So if we were to step back and say, and look at this divergence between the least developed countries on the one hand and the rich countries on the other, we would say that international economic law is partially accountable. And part of the problem has been that there has been an unwillingness to implement these principles in the design of the rules as they have affected the least developed countries. So let me just briefly close by turning to the other question of internal economic inequality, so the gap within countries. Now, that's an issue that's been left largely off the table as far as the design of international economic law is concerned. We've sort of said, look, we're going to grow the pie globally, and it's up to individual countries to say internally how they'll distribute the gains from trade. But one of the questions I think that trade commentators and analysts are increasingly asking in this era of pronounced inequality and accompanying instability is whether we actually need to bring those questions of distributive justice and equality within countries to the table for negotiation and institutional design within international economic law. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. I really, and some of the next conversation around institutional design we've already kind of touched upon, but I think I want to go back to the why do the SDGs matter a little bit. I think that, there is, and as we merge into that conversation on institutional design, because I think the opportunity that Fatima laid out for us, that this is the opportunity to reset the normative framework on how we engage, given both the pros and the cons of how international law is engaging and contributing to or exacerbating inequality. And I think that with that in mind, I'd love to hear, and maybe we can start with Fatima to tell us a little bit about in terms of institutional design, what institutional features are advancing or impeding the SDG 5 around gender equality, SDG 10 around global inequality issues, and an institutional access to justice, peace, and inclusion. What are the institutional features or the institutions themselves as it pertains to the legal rules and the organizations? We've heard a little bit about the trade rules not being enabling or accessible. What role can they play in the institutional design of the framework as it currently is to help contribute?
Yeah, thanks, Kimberly. It's a great question. So, if we just take a step back and we think about what are the greatest contributions of the dialogue and the debate around the Sustainable Development Goals, what we're seeing is, in addition to the norms that are set, right, by saying, we're going to, end, around gender inequality, and as we think about the broader spaces, what you're also seeing is that the SDGs have to get advanced by making sure that we're integrating into our normative behavior, right, at a national level, at a global level, gender policies, social protection policies, environmental protection policies, human rights impact assessments, and rights-based approaches, right? So an example of that is the one UN mandate to support human rights. It's bodies that have been tasked with furthering economic, social, and cultural rights, such as human rights conventions, the Human Rights Council, and to some degree, ECOSOC on the UN. So we know that you're seeing this real conversation dialogue take place of how do you actually integrate, and you're seeing that happen not just at the bilateral level in governments. You're seeing that also happen in multilateral spaces, multilateral institutions, even the new institutions that are coming up in these spaces. International public financial institutions, if we stay in that space for a moment, they've been pretty innovative actually in addressing some of these barriers for the most marginalized and making sure that they have more agency, they have more power, and they have more voice on what affects their own development pathways. And I think that's been a pretty big shift in the conversation and the ways of working. We still have a long ways to go, though, to make sure it actually happens. But you're now seeing a new norm emerging of institutional mechanisms of social and environmental safeguards, as an example, or independent accountability mechanisms are now widely understood. They're integrated. We understand that it's not just good practice to have those things, but in fact, it's absolutely necessary to have good institutional functions to protect those spaces if you're actually going to address the root cause and the systematic approaches of what's driving poverty in the first place. So you're seeing that new shift over the last decade, and I think that's having some profound effects. But I wanted to actually come back around where are the limits to that too, and where are we not seeing some of those spaces? So, I think Kate and Chantel have really laid out an argument here around tax and trade and looking at some of those issues. One of the things we've seen at Oxfam is that if there's never, we always say in the development space, I work for an international development organization. We spend every day thinking about combating poverty all around the world. And the arguments we always face from institutions, from governments is there's just not enough money. And we're sorry, there's not enough money to do this, right? Well, it's all about how we decide to spend our money, of course, and the choices we make. We know that if we were able to get the richest 1% in the world to pay just an extra 0.5% of extra tax, we would have enough money to solve almost every one of these big problems that we're talking about. And yet we see in Oxfam's work on international tax policy, we're seeing that institutional features that are built in and baked into our national and global systems are still impeding us from achieving these sustainable development goals, right? So when it comes to international tax, as an example, international tax treaties, inequality is actually institutionalized. It's baked into our mechanisms for how we address these issues, right? So most of the 3,000 plus bilateral tax treaties that exist currently today, they're actually largely copied and pasted from either one of two model treaties or templates that are out there. There's the OECD model that's out there that often favors rich countries. And then there's a UN model out there favored by developing countries. On balance, the OECD model provides more taxing rights to the investor's residence country, like the case of the US, for instance, if like US mining corporate interests in Peru, as an example. The UN model will give more taxing rights to the source where the activity takes place, so to Peru, where the mine's actually located. But we know that at the heart of a lot of this, tax policy is so important because it's so baked in, and the protections are baked in that actually can promote and expand inequality. We know that that's one of those core areas that we're going to have to address if we're really going to tackle the SDGs in particular. So, there's a debate, very live debate, as you know, about aid remaining really important for aid debt cancellation for the poorest countries. But actually, most poor people, if you live in India or Indonesia, they receive negligible amounts of foreign aid, right? That's not where they're going to get the relief from. They actually need to raise their own resources, their own funding, to fund their schools, their hospitals, their institutions. Those countries are struggling to raise taxes in a fair and just and equitable way. And then when they raise them, how to distribute them in a way that actually favor the most poor and the most vulnerable. So tax policy, I would say, as you think about new norms, that we're going to have to push harder into that space if we're going to achieve SDG 10 around inequality in particular. But I would say it also applies to SDG 5 and 16 as well, right? That's going to be one of the spaces I think we have more work to do because the inequalities are so baked into our current systems. And there's a really rich conversation, I think, about how best to do that and address that. But I would just put that out for discussion.
Absolutely. Kate, I know you spoke a little bit about setting the tone with some of the guiding principles that really, as it pertains to inequality, should really be baked into the systems as well. What are your thoughts about really how the institutional features, whether they're helping address these issues and how they can better address some of the issues around SDGs 6, 10, and 16, particularly organizations or some of the legal rules that you interact with as it pertains to trade?
That's a really good question. And I think the institutional features of trade, as you know, following what I think all three of us were agreeing on in our opening comments, the institutional features of trade can both contribute to inequality, and they can contribute to equality. I think two of the main institutional features of trade that come to mind for me are that it's an evolutionary process. You create institutions, you create trade agreements, and then you create new trade agreements, and then you have the MFN clause, and everybody gets to take advantage of the new trade agreements. And in that way, trade is also decentralized in a lot of ways. We have the WTO, we have the organizational structure associated with that. We have other larger multinational trade type organizations that deal with trade. But there's a lot of bilateral instruments that affect trade, and I think Fatima's also highlighted the importance of tax treaties, and the idea of treaties sort of impeding or furthering along sort of a domestic dialogue in around the SDGs. So I think these two features or factors of trade law, the fact that it's evolutionary and the fact that it's decentralized, these can allow a country, if it has the political will, as Fatima was talking about, if you have a group of countries that have the political will to move forward with these goals, they can do that. And we've seen, I'll give a few examples in a moment of a few countries who've decided to do exactly that. But on the other hand, countries won't necessarily be required to do that under the way the system operates. And Chantal mentioned a political convergence, a partial convergence on norms since World War II, and I think we're and the convergence is ongoing, unclear where it's going to go. But I'll give the examples of the countries where we see the SDGs coming into these trade agreements in particular. So the one good example is Canada, which is included in a couple of more recent trade agreements, chapters on trade and gender. And these are trade agreements that Canada formed with both Israel and Chile. These chapters refer specifically to SDG 5. They reaffirm the importance to the parties of those goals, or of that goal. They acknowledge the importance of incorporating a gender perspective into economic growth and fostering inclusive economic growth. They also reaffirm other existing commitments, the CEDAW and other institutions. So again, those are two of Canada's treaties. We see similar chapters on sustainable development in a number of recent free trade agreements with the European Union. The European Union's trade agreement with Canada, with Vietnam, and with Japan. These all have sustainable development chapters. They seem to be more focused on the SDGs that relate to labor and the environment. But they do incorporate the SDGs, and they do kind of keep the SDGs in the sort of the trade dialogue box in a way. I should also note the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area includes a reference to the SDGs in its general objectives and in the Protocol on Trade and Services. So I think there's 24 members to that agreement, also a relatively new agreement, and we'll see how those references end up playing out as it moves forward. A final example that I might flag is not a reference to the SDGs in particular, but is sort of an acknowledgement of the fact that some of these issues that the SDGs sort of crystallize, those are existing concerns, and they, you don't need a reference to the SDG in particular in order to further it. And this is with the Netherlands Model Investment Agreement, which I believe is from December 2018. This is a model agreement, and it includes a provision on sustainable development. And that refers to the contribution of women to economic growth and their participation in international investment and other economic activities. It uses hortatory language that calls for the removal of barriers to women's participation in the economy. So thinking about, we do see here that some countries have political will to include this in their agreement. They are working towards doing so. They're finding ways to do so in a variety of mechanisms. I think it's too early to tell how this is going to turn out. As I've said, these are all very recent instruments, and we'll have to see what effect they may have. The Canadian agreements and the EU agreements, I believe as well, they all call for committee meetings periodically. we'll have to see what comes out of those committee meetings, and whether sort of there's the partial convergence on this, whether which way that goes.
Sure, sure. I think one thing that was touched upon, and I think particularly as it pertains to institutional design, I think Chantal, you touched upon this a lot in your introductory statements, and I think what I'd really like to get your thoughts on is whether you think that international legal rules and organizations are participatory in nature as it pertains to the SDGs, and how, if not, how can we begin addressing that and making them more participatory and inclusive, and not just the realm of for lawyers and international legal practitioners or development practitioners?
It's a great question, and it really cuts at the heart of a lot of really fundamental institutional design questions. I mean, who decides and who's in the room are really important questions. And sometimes the answers aren't as straightforward as you might think. So, for example, we care about the SDGs, we care about these principles of global justice and equality. And so we might think that that means that we should have more open participation and more transparency in every setting. And that's certainly been a major achievement of global civil society, to get in the room or to get close to the room in the hallway of a lot of negotiations where rules are being set and decisions are being made. And that's, I think, had really crucial impact. At the same time, there are those voices that say that if you introduce global civil society, that you may be reinforcing another kind of inequality, because most of global civil society is located in the global north. And so you get developing country governments who are a little bit suspicious about labor, environment, human rights activism, and might see it as a form of quote unquote disguised protectionism, as the trade lawyers like to say, who would be suspicious of NGOs coming in the room and undermining their sovereignty and what is already a really imbalance, and what is already an imbalance of power between more powerful governments in the global north and those in the global south. So how would you strike at that? And what would you do about the fact that global civil society is not necessarily equitably allocated across issues? So Oxfam is one of the few really highly visible civil society groups that focuses on development and poverty. Most others have other focal points. And so you might wind up with another question of equality and representation there. Is one question. Another example would be we care about the SDGs and justice and equality, so perhaps we should all be for incorporating human rights obligations and labor obligations into trade agreements. I'm for that on balance, but there are some questions that come along with that. If you incorporate labor and human rights obligations into trade agreements, then the individuals and actors who will be enforcing them will, unless you do something about it, they'll be trade lawyers and trade experts, and they will not necessarily have the background or the sensibility of labor law and human rights law. And so you might wind up with decisions that maybe don't reflect the underlying principles. And this was one criticism of the Guatemala, the case that was brought on labor rights under the Central American Free Trade Agreement between the U.S. and Guatemala, where it was very closely watched. It was seen as a really great opportunity to actually implement the labor chapter of the Central American Free Trade Agreement, and you got a decision that there had not been a violation because of the interpretation of the language that you had in the agreement. And so there was some criticism of that, saying, we had folks who maybe weren't as steeped in the interpretation of labor law as they could have been. So that's not a so when you're thinking about linking, there's more to the story than simply saying, right, we're going to incorporate all of these obligations. There's much more that has to be done for you to get the outcome that you want. But that's not a reason not to do it. It's a reason to move forward and really attend to these other questions of implementation and interpretation. And in fact, what you have in the new US-Mexico-Canada agreement is there are some instructions, essentially principles and guidelines of interpretation that are a reaction to that outcome in the Guatemala case that should help in, if any, further cases are brought under that language in that context. So those are some of the design questions that you have to think about in terms of how participatory. So who's participating and under what circumstances are really, really important questions.
Fatima, do you have some thoughts particularly on participation and how we can create a more inclusive environment and that's more participatory in nature?
Yeah, no, thanks. I really appreciate, Chantel, your response in this space. And this is a really, as you think about the nuts and bolts about how do we get the SDGs over the finish line, these are the types of challenges we actually really have to sit and address and think about. To Chantel's point, we know the reality is, and all of us work in this international space, we know the reality is very few institutions today open up their decision-making processes beyond the most powerful nation states of control, right? That is the reality. All of us have lived and worked in that reality, and we see it every day. That being said, I actually wanted to say there have been some interesting developments worth noting in the space that maybe we can learn from and think about new ways of working. So we have seen that some institutions now are enabling more shared governance. And what does that look like of a shared governance model? So you have, for instance, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the World Conservation Union, and the International Labor Organization. These are all examples where nation states are actually looking at ways of sharing power with key constituencies, all the way up to their governing boards, right? So not just at the committee level, but including at the governance level of their governing boards. If we think about new models like this of shared governance that are starting to emerge, they could actually help us address some of these structural and institutional barriers that are preventing us giving voice and agency to those who are the most effective. And really, that's the transformative change we're talking about when it comes to the SDGs. It can't just be the most powerful in the world, despite your intent, and your intent can be a positive intent in the places that we all sit in. It can't just be the most powerful advocating for the most powerless. It is a change of balance of power, literally the balance of power shifting in those norms. So what I think, as we think about new normative behaviors that we have to be thinking about and where international law can help us, it's really assuming that instead of assuming that powerful government interests will inclusively reflect the interests of the most marginalized groups, it's really creating space for those most marginalized groups. And there's challenges, and I think Chantel has done a good job of addressing some of those challenges. And I would say, despite those challenges, we have to move forward and we have to figure out ways. And I'm really glad to see that there's models emerging. I also just wanted to quickly, Kimberly, call out the OECD, right? Because this is a really powerful body as we think about this space. Today, the OECD is currently facilitating the most ambitious set of reforms to international tax rules. They're revisiting first principles that were established, 100 years ago. So they're even adopting, as an example, a global minimum tax for large multinational corporations, right? So this could be a profound shift. Despite this, developing countries and organizations like Oxfam have challenged the OECD's legitimacy to lead these negotiations. And that's led the OECD to include and to create what they are calling an inclusive framework. This is so that negotiations and decisions don't happen without the consent of not just within the OECD Council member of states, but also including voices from an ad hoc group of representative members that are open up to all governments. So all 130 governments could actually have voice, and 130 governments have actually signed up. So these are other ways that this could increase legitimacy. Unfortunately, over 60 countries still aren't participating in that space, and participating countries are required to sign up to a previous OECD agreement on tax, which they are not able to influence. Nonetheless, these are the kinds of steps and the pushes I think we need to start seeing in the system. I just want to underscore that improving developing country voice and power in the governance of our systems, right, in all the spaces we occupy, whether they're bilateral spaces, multilateral spaces. Think about the IFIs, that are international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. If we don't change the inclusiveness, including at the governance level, we're not going to really achieve the SDGs and the full power of the intent of what we all are working so hard to do. Thanks.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to merge, because an hour runs by really fast as I'm looking at our clock here, and this conversation is something that we could go on for quite some time about. But I'm going to try to merge a number of the questions that I've gotten from the audience that really speak to our last dimension on practice. And we've spoken to it a little bit in the comments that have come from the panelists around how we can break down issue area silos, and not only who is at the table, who's in the governance structures, and some of this, but there's also the issue that's coming from the audiences around how do you prioritize? How can we, in practice, how do we make sure that we are really looking at transforming the operation and in practice, in a practical, tangible way? So if a most pressing need for our country at that moment is overcoming global pandemic or overcoming a drought or overcoming issues of hunger, how do we, or other issues that are really pressing priority concerns, and the inequality issues, of course, as we've discussed throughout the panel, it's an underlying fundamental issue that exacerbates all of those issues. But how do we in practice really help prioritize and also set the tone for how operationally and in practice we can address this in terms of the issue of inequality? And I'm going to throw that out to the panel. I don't know who wants to kind of dive in and jump in first, because I've kind of altered the parameters and I'm throwing in the question from the audience. But if there's any kind of thoughts that are emerging, please jump in.
Well, I can jump in to just as a reaction and by way of picking up some of the earlier threads. It's a great question, obviously, crucial question. I think to pick up on what Fatima was saying just now, and to underscore, I think, a theme within what she was saying about capacity building, that if you can empower voices to come forward to articulate those pressing concerns and really be heard, then I think that's so crucial. And there is really exciting and important progress being made, both in terms of capacity building for developing country government actors to articulate their own concerns, so that you don't get these cookie cutter tax and investment and trade treaties, that you do get a better reflection of what local priorities are, and also capacity building across civil society as well as the public sectors. And the more that can happen, I think the better and more responsive these mechanisms can be to the priorities that emerge on the ground. So attending to the question of capacity building is really central.
Absolutely. As we're kind of coming to the last bit of the panel, I want to turn over to Kate to have some remarks, particularly on that question that came from the audience.
So piggybacking on Chantal's references to capacity building, I think that's a really good point. And maybe it's difficult for an international organization or sort of an overarching group to prioritize among what may be most important to one particular government. But what an organization can do, and I'm speaking about the WTO in particular here, it can help governments in achieving whatever they would like to do, and can create mechanisms that forward those goals. So I'm thinking in particular about provisions that in which the WTO Secretariat will provide assistance to developing country members with respect to their disputes, with respect to making experts available, providing technical cooperation, providing training. The World Trade Organization also has essentially a legal aid group, the Advisory Center on WTO Law, which helps developing countries deal with WTO issues both inside and outside the disputes forum. So efforts like these, they indicate that the sort of organizations exist, and they can help countries with their own capacity building and can forward those goals as countries see fit. Because I think the point was made earlier, there can be sometimes some suspicion of groups like that, and of sort of outsiders coming in and telling us what to do. But if the mechanism is there and it's available, maybe that's a forum that can allow a country to move forward with the goals that it as it wants to.
Absolutely. So I'm going to try to hand over to our lovely panelists to give us kind of, I like to always end on a note of solutions and a note of kind of looking forward, 10 years left in the 2030 agenda of really achieving, a more just, inclusive, and equal world, and one that really is and eradicating some of these norms and issues that have been plaguing us for time immemorial. What would in a 1 minute summary, what would your takeaway be for our audience today, really on what we should do moving forward in terms of international law as a tool to address global inequality? Fatima, let's start with you.
Sure. So, I would summarize it like this. International law right now and the power of law has this incredible ability to shift incentives today. And what I mean by that is, look, if you're an international actor, and that could be a sovereign state, but it could also be a corporation or a multilateral institution, we know that behavior is ultimately guided by interests and incentives, right? And the power of law, especially international law, lies in its ability to shift those incentives. So that's why, when we think about fundamental civic freedoms here in the United States and all around the world, whether that's freedom of expression, assembly, association, these are so important right now. They're creating the conditions that actually enable people to join together and create the political and social pressure that can shift these incentives and behaviors of powerful states, companies, and institutions. So the power of the law here is so incredibly important. And we're seeing just actually, frankly, a stark example of that play out here in the streets right now in the United States, right? The power of collective action by a mass of motivated people coming into the streets every day to protest, joining together online, putting pressure on institutions to take real action on deep structural systemic racism in a way that, frankly, no other force could conceivably do. So the power of popular action to shift political will is so incredibly relevant to our times today, but it only happens if our laws give space for that to happen. So I would leave our audience members with the power that they sit on right now is so incredibly relevant, impactful, and timely, and how they choose to use that power is really going to ultimately decide our collective fate.
Absolutely. Chantal, what about you?
Yeah, well, that's really well said. Just add a few other thoughts. And so, one is, we focus on international law in this conversation, setting the norms, this articulating principles. It's really key, and at the same time, we see the challenges related to implementation of those principles. Some of those have to do with the design of the international institutions, but there are also so many other ways, as Fatima was just suggesting, that we can connect, the principle to the real world. And I think, especially when we're thinking about human rights, labor rights, development, these kinds of issues, it's really important to also look at the background legal rules that are shaping an environment. So it may not be, the labor chapter of an international trade agreement. It might be a tort litigation. It might be, corporate social responsibility. It may be other domains. It might be a protest. It might be a combination. And so I think not only looking at the power of civil discourse, but also other areas where you may have more effective legal rules that can be used to implement some of these principles is really key. It may be the best thing you can do for labor rights. Doesn't reside under international trade law. Similarly, for gender equality, which has been an increasing focus, the best thing that we can do probably for gender equality is to really improve parental leave and parental rights. And daycare for all. The last time I looked, that wasn't in any trade agreement. So that multi-level way of thinking, and what are the other domains in which we can pursue some of these goals, I think will always be key.
Absolutely. Kate, what about you? I know we're running low on time, but I'd love to hear your thoughts particularly.
I don't have much to add to those two. Very tough to follow, but I'll just echo. Let's keep the dialogue going on these issues. We've discussed today a number of instruments that incorporate the SDGs, the ideas behind them, and a number of ways in which we can, as was said, use the power that you have, and attempt to connect the principles behind the SDGs or the SDGs themselves to the real world. We see these being incorporated in recent instruments, and we'll see how this goes as we move toward 2030.
Great. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your time here at the conference. And thank you to our wonderful panelists for such an enlightening and inspiring conversation today about the role of the SDGs and international law. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.